So we'll start with the second keynote of the MODELS conference. So today we are pleased to welcome Blair, who is distinguished professor at the University of Lancaster in the School of Computing and Communication. He is also adjunct professor at the University of Tromsø in Norway, and he is also director of the iWire Center for Doctoral Training. He is working on in the field of distributed systems and middleware, as well as in model-driven engineering for adaptive systems, and all the applicability of such area in the environmental science. He has published 300 papers, and he has a national index of 51. He participated to many program committee, and he is also the chair of the steering committee of the middleware conference. He is one of the co-authors of the very influential book entitled Distributed Systems, Concepts and Design, whose last edition was published in 2011, and he is co-editor-in-chief of the Springer Journal of Internet Services and Application. He also really interested recently on how innovation in distributed systems can support environmental scientists in tackling global problems such as climate change, and I guess that will be part of your keynote today. So please go. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everybody. I always find these introductions vaguely embarrassing. So here's my shorter version. I'm Gordon. I'm the son of a steel worker from Glasgow. I'm a Scot and proud European, and I'm here to talk to you about models. It's a real privilege to be here for reasons that will become clear in a few minutes. Models is a conference that I've not always attended, but it's always been very close to my heart. What I'm bringing to you today is a challenge. The title is Grand Challenges, Grand Responses, ? And the big clue is in the question mark. So if you bear with me, I'm going to challenge you as a conference and a community to see if you're ready for some of the grand challenges of today. It'll take a little bit of time to build up towards that challenge. If you bear with me, I'll take you on a journey, a very personal journey in many ways that I've been on as a computer scientist over the last few years. So let me get started. First of all, why am I here? The reason it's a real privilege to be here is I can stand up here and make a personal tribute to a dear friend and a very important person in the models community who sadly is no longer with us. I'm sure I'm not alone in saying I simply would not be here if it wasn't for this man. You know, Robert Franz was a really important part of your community. How many people in the audience have been drawn into important problems, have been drawn in to clusters of scientists working on important problems because of Robert? That happened to me, I think roughly just around the Genoa instance of this conference, when myself, Nellie and Robert started to work on the appreciation and importance of models in terms of understanding and managing complex distributed systems, which led to, of course, models at runtime. So thank you, Robert. There's something missing from the conference with the lack of your presence. That's why I'm here. So my wife is a Methodist local preacher, so I pick up all my oratory tips from her. So we start off with our text for the day, and the text for the day is taken from Robert, chapter 1. I believe Bernard might be in the audience as well. This is a paper that was written in 2007, and it was written for the Future of Software Engineering event, which had some marvelous papers and some marvelous challenges and insights into software engineering and its future. And one of the things that the paper of Robert highlights is the problem implementation gap. The gap between how we describe and reason about our problems in the problem domain and the abstractions that we as software engineers and computer scientists offer to those working in sometimes very challenging problem domains. He wrote this in 2007, and he posed the question, how can modelling techniques, bearing in mind that in some ways modelling techniques are sitting on a gold seam of potential here, how can they tame the complexity of such problems and reduce that problem implementation gap? A very obvious challenge. And what I'm doing is reflecting now, 10 years on, 10 years of research in the model-driven engineering community. Has this problem implementation gap narrowed? What progress has been made? Can we now look around the conference and see the tools and techniques we're all working on? Have we really cracked this? Are we able to enter into different problem domains and say, here are the tools that reduce that problem implementation gap close to zero? Or are we offering tools that just basically maintain the same problem implementation gap as we had in 2007? And in particular, what I'm talking about today is my exposure to one particular community, which is the environmental sciences community, which I would argue, and many people would argue, is one of the grand challenges of the 21st century, if not the grand challenge. When I go and talk to them, can I offer them tools that help them address the problem implementation gap? That's what I'm talking about, effectively. So a little bit about myself and background. As the introduction said, I'm a professor of distributed systems. People tell me I have a reputation for research in distributed systems. I've worked in many aspects of middleware. I've worked on interoperability problems. I've worked on cloud computing, Internet of Things, lots of wonderful areas of innovation. And one of the reasons I enjoy models and feel attached to this community is I have a strong interest not just in the technology of distributed systems, but in software engineering principles, which help you manage the complexity of distributed systems. That's been a core thread throughout my career. Just recently, I've started working in more applied problems. Is applied a dirty word? Should I remain working on fundamental computer science problems? That's something that's actually facing many of us in the audience. There's something curious about computer science these days as we become more ubiquitous, as Mark Weiser's vision unfolds of ubiquitous computing. It's not the chips that are getting everywhere. It's us as computer scientists are getting everywhere. We're entering domains and becoming fundamental partners in areas of health informatics and environment and smart cities. And we're becoming more applied. Is that a good thing? Personally, I think it is. We're working in the real world, we're solving real world problems, we're responding to grand challenges. What a terrific privilege. I just want to go back a few years to my birthday. We're a weird family. We don't have parties and eat cake. My wife takes me to challenging films on my birthday. This was my birthday, February 2013, and this film had just come out, a film called Chasing Ice. Has anybody seen the film Chasing Ice? No, that's a real shame. Go and watch it. It transformed my life. Chasing Ice is a film by Jim Balog, who's an American environmental scientist who was working on problems of climate change. He was an environmental modeler, more of that later. He was building models, he was producing time series analyses related to climate change, and he was getting frustrated. The message is getting lost. somehow the wondrous time series analysis he was producing was not convincing the world of the threat of climate change. So he made a film, he made a movie. And what he did is he went to extreme parts of the planet to record ice melt. In some way, it's an artistic film about ice. There's some beautiful shots of the Arctic landscape, some beautiful shots of ice. There's also some utterly astonishing shots of ice melt that reflect exactly what's happening now. Physical evidence of climate change now, and they actually captured the biggest calving event ever recorded, which I'm about to play. Now, a calving event is where an ice sheet breaks away, and I'm just going to play that now with a commentary by Jim Baylog.
We're just observers. These two little dots on the side of the mountain. And we watched and recorded the largest witness calving event ever caught on tape.
So how big was this calving event that we just looked at? We'll resort to some illustrations again to give you a sense of scale. It's as if the entire lower tip of Manhattan broke off, except that the thickness, the height of it, is equivalent to buildings that are 2.5 or 3 times higher than they are. That's a magical, miraculous, horrible, scary thing. I don't know that anybody's really seen the miracle and horror of that. It took 100 years for it to retreat 8 miles from 1900 to 2000. From 2000 to 2010, it retreated 9 miles. So in 10 years, it retreated more than it had in the previous 100.
So, Chasing Ice, the film, I recommend it to all of you. What impact did it have on me? I'd already started working with environmental scientists. I'd worked with environmental scientists for about 3 or 4 years prior to this. But for me, it was an intellectual exercise. What this film did to me was it turned an intellectual exercise to something coming more from the heart. It moved me. I don't know if you heard the sound of breaking ice. I've actually sat and listened to this without the video. The sound is unearthly, it's unnatural. It's the earth crying out. That sound gets to me every time. It's physical evidence of the earth in pain. And that's something I responded to. I made a decision at that point to change my career. I made a decision to devote my skills as a computer scientist to work alongside environmental scientists and to make that the core of my intellectual endeavour, and to devote the remaining years I have on this planet to help work on grand challenges. If there's other people in the audience that want to join me in that quest, there's plenty of problems, as will become apparent, and there is a real need for computer science, as I will unpick over the next 20 minutes or so. Coincidence. How often does coincidence work in your favour? Not long after I made this decision, there was a call from the research councils in the UK for senior fellowships, 5-year senior fellowships, to work on digital technology and environmental change. I, of course, applied. I put all my efforts into getting this, and I was successful. So I stand before you at the start of a 5-year fellowship. I now have a 5-year fellowship to work pretty much full-time with a team of postdocs. brackets, if anybody's looking for a postdoc in a challenging area, I'm recruiting, end of advert. So I now have a wonderful position where not only have I got the drive from the heart, but I have the funding to really push forward with this agenda. And I started this fellowship at the start of September, so it's really hot off the press. And I'll report in some of the early results. So this is precisely to look at digital technologies, what we as computer scientists can do to help people understand better the climate with all its subtle interdependencies, with a big emphasis on the subtle interdependencies, and then to come up with grounded, data-driven mitigation and adaptation strategies. And my philosophy and approach is very much to work alongside scientists to enable them to do better science. I'm not an environmental scientist. I'll never understand their worlds, but I can work alongside them to provide them with better tools. So scientists are a fundamental partner in all I do, to give them the tools to transform what they do, and also pick up on some key themes like uncertainty, which is something this community addresses, and abstraction, providing them the right level of abstraction, closing that problem implementation gap to enable them not to hack Linux scripts, but actually do science. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to step through the problem space and try and paint a picture of what this problem domain is like. And then move on to the implementation space. What the underlying technology may look like and its complexities, and then pose the question, the rhetorical question of whether that gap is narrow enough, and then look at what models can do, and henceforth move on to the challenge. Environmental scientists have had a jolt. It's almost wrong to call this, to talk about environmental science, because when you work with this area, it's the most diverse, wonderfully eclectic group of people you could imagine. It's a mixture of physicists, chemists, biologists, ecologists, working on soil science, hydrology, biodiversity. They have very little in common. They have different philosophies, different routes, different experimental methods. Historically, they did this. And I think this is a wonderful picture that captures environmental science in action. They go out into the field, they do these boreholes, they pull out some soil, they'll go back to the lab and they'll analyze that soil. And you can have some wonderful conversations where they'll tell you everything you need to know about a metre of soil. Fascinating creatures locked into their problem domain. Experts in soil, or maybe the chemistry of soil, or nitrogen in soil, or one particular narrow niche aspect. Does that sound familiar? Niche science, where we get locked into a tiny, tiny, narrow sliver of the greater picture of understanding. And then along comes the challenge of climate change, and all is transformed. And I don't think you could overestimate the jolt to the system this has been for scientists. Scientists now have to work together. They need to understand climate change in all its complex facets. They need to understand complex systems and their interdependencies. They need to work together. They need to step into the world of the bearded ecologist just down the corridor and understand their world. They need to do integrative big science. That is a huge jolt to the system. They have people from the Environment Agency knocking on their doors saying, floods, My city flooded last Christmas with devastating effects on small businesses and in population. Will that happen again? How do we prevent it? How do we manage the social, environmental, political implications of that? They're being asked these questions and they're kind of going, well, I'm not sure. I can tell you all about a metre of soil. Don't want to know that. We want to know answers to the impacts of the changing environment and how we mitigate and adapt to these challenges. This is a picture I borrowed from my colleagues. I'm now, as part of my sabbatical, I've moved into the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, which is it's like an INRAE of the environment. It's a government-sponsored research lab. There's 4 sites around the UK. So during my sabbatical, I'm living with these guys, not literally. But I'm going around meeting scientists and I'm trying to understand their world and going around the different sites and having wonderful conversations about what they think the challenges are of environmental science and how technology can help them. So that's what I'm doing for this year. This is a slide that came up and it shows you the sudden jump in ambition in this community. This is a picture taken from an emerging field which is sometimes called natural capital, sometimes called ecosystem services, and it's a desire to understand systems from multiple viewpoints, from multiple dimensions. Just look at this picture and look at its complexity. There was a comment in the first keynote, which I thought was wonderful, by the way. There was a comment, I don't understand people. They're not deterministic. For this keynote, I shall say the opposite. We have to understand people, we have to understand society, we have to understand the complexities of the world when you have at the top people problems and the problems that people impose on the natural environment. We have to understand the natural environment from an atmospheric, biological, hydrological point of view and so on. And somehow we have to understand this space. And out of that, understand the complex system. This is a grand challenge that's way beyond putting a man on the moon. The ambition in this slide is astonishing. And let me just state right up front, from talking to the community, they do not have the tools to do this. Let me just unpick their world a little bit more and step through some of their complexities. I've already made the first point, I think, quite well. We're now in a world of a new kind of big science. Big science, interrelated science, complex systems thinking, focus on the individual components and how they all hang together, bridging over to the human dimension. Given that, we all know the processes of nature are changing. We all know of climate change. They're trying to understand the complexities given the level of change and the huge amount of uncertainty there is in understanding the impact of that change. And somehow we need to inform politicians, brackets, if they're listening, close brackets, how we cope with this, how we mitigate, how we adapt to a world of 2 degrees. Heaven forbid. What's on the table? New tools. Thankfully, there are new tools emerging. Are these tools the right ones? Are they integrated enough to be unfolded later in the talk? One of the biggest moves in science is towards new modelling paradigms. Environmental scientists build models, not the kind of models that you guys work on. The keynote that Steve Easterbrook did last year unpicked the differences in the models, and he did a very good job of that, so I'm not going to repeat that. But effectively what they develop is process models that represent their current understanding of the natural environment, and then they'll tune these process models according to historical or real-time data so they can then make better predictions of the future. So they build models, sometimes very complex models, sometimes surprisingly simple models that represent different facets of the environment. The dominant trend, though, is combining models, integrating models. Sometimes call it ensemble models, and there's many different ways they do this. They might run Monte Carlo simulation. They'll run us a model, and they'd love to do it, and this is where cloud computing can help, for example. They would love to be able to run models not 5, 6, 7 times. They would love to be able to run models hundreds of thousands of times. A step change in their ability to run many models, and to start to understand the sensitivities to different parameters, and hence try and unpick the uncertainties in the models. So they would love to be able to run models many times with different parameters. Perturbed physics is a term they sometimes use. They'd love to be able to run different models, and this is what happens with climate science. Run different models so that they can compare the outputs, and if different scientists with different assumptions and different models are all pointing towards a certain element of climate change, there's an impact of uncertainty. And they'd love to cascade models together, and I've got some examples of that to follow. The outputs of one model feeding into the inputs of another, perhaps enlarge models of the natural environment, perhaps of an ecosystem service, going back to the previous slide. One of my colleagues, Keith Bevan, who is the person that first got me involved working with environmental scientists, he has the proud claim, he's the most cited hydrologist, but he doesn't care about that. What he cares about is he's in the top 10 beards of environmental science in the world. This is a prestigious title, right up there with a Nobel Prize in this community. One of the top 10 beards of environmental science. What an honour. There is such a web page, look it up. New modelling paradigms. Big data. Again, you don't have to spend long in environmental science before you realise they're seeking new sources of data. Big data is everywhere. Many of you will work in big data problems. It's slightly different in the environmental science world. It's not like the world of physics where you get huge streams of very homogeneous data. In the environmental sciences world, what you tend to have is lots of data, very heterogeneous data, some of it very small but significant, but from many different sources. And integrating that data is really important. And also scavenging data from where you can get it. So they have remote sensing systems and satellites, for example. You can start to use that data more effectively and combine it with some of the data they see on the ground from Earth observation systems, from telemetry, to give you a better estimation. Can they exploit citizen science? A huge area, for example, in ecology. You can't have environmental scientists going round counting the number of bees in the UK. It doesn't scale, so they rely on citizen science. What do you do with that data? How accurate is it? Lots and lots of different sources of data, exploiting them, combining them, using them in integrated ways, and then perhaps feeding them into models as well to gain a better understanding. And data science. The techniques to make sense of this data having a very, very big impact in the community. Although this is very much just emerging. Has machine learning any role in understanding the wonderful world of complex environmental data? Could a machine learning algorithm win a Nobel Prize? Slightly provocative perspective. Could you discover something the scientists are missing in a very positivist interpretation of the natural world? What about some of the cutting-edge work in statistics? We're privileged to have a marvellous statistics group at Lancaster who work on extreme value theory, change point analysis that are very relevant to the natural world. Extreme value theory having a more subtle interpretation of the extremes, not as outliers, but as precisely the statistical points that tell you most. And what are the techniques that help environmental scientists interpret their data more accurately? You might think this is all happening, but it's not. The world of siloed science is really getting in the way of a response to grand challenges. Statisticians don't talk enough to environmental scientists. Different brands of environmental scientists don't talk enough to each other. Computer scientists don't talk enough to environmental scientists. So they're simply not aware of the potential of many of these techniques on this slide. The other cross-cutting concerns, if you like, if you take anything from this slide, it's uncertainty. I don't like the word uncertainty. I've searched my thesaurus for alternatives and haven't quite found it. The word uncertainty implies that we're uncertain about climate change, which is, of course, completely wrong. And it's been picked up in the press as an excuse. Scientists are uncertain. Scientists are not uncertain. Scientists are certain, but they're uncertain at the margins. They know their models are abstractions. They know their models are inaccurate. They know when they start to combine models, the uncertainties escalate. What they really want is a way of reifying and reasoning about uncertainty, and to have that as an integral part of the science. It's quite surprising that doesn't happen well enough. I had a very exciting talk at my fellowship launch event. Professor Jim Hall from Oxford, who's a leading scientist in climate change and impact and flood prediction. You meet some people and you think, wow, that's someone of gravitas. What he is doing is he's building a reasoning framework for uncertainty and risk management, and using that to drive the model execution patterns. So the models that execute are in response for a reasoning framework that reasons about risk and uncertainty. And this happens dynamically. That is exactly where the science has to go. But he's many years ahead of the community. Does this all sound familiar though? Uncertainty, complexity, dynamic adaptation. Yeah, is that not something you guys have something to say, to talk about? Can we help them make that leap towards where they have to be? And of course, they need better spatial and temporal resolution. They need to be able to predict not in 5 kilometre squares, but perhaps 1 kilometre squares, or perhaps even smaller than that, so they can tell individual businesses or communities the likelihood of flooding. They can reduce the resolution of their models. They also want to be able to reason and jump about scales and geographical locations. At one level, talk about climate change globally. At another level, talk about it nationally. At another level, think about it locally, where perhaps some of the true mitigation or adaptation strategies are possible. Jumping about scales is a complex thing to do. Reasoning about systems at different scales as an added challenge. And just to jump back and link to the talk last year, Steve talked exclusively about climate change models, as I understand. I wasn't here. In some ways, that's the glamorous and most advanced end of environmental science. This is well-established, well-funded work. He talked about the architecture of some of the integrated models they're doing. That community is way in advance of other aspects of environmental science in terms of integration, simply because when you build models of the climate on a global scale, you need to look at the impacts of sea ice and oceans and atmosphere and the interactions, and they have a rather reasonable software architecture, shall we say, with couplers that manage the interaction between this. And it's also managed by significant large efforts, like in Colorado, the NCAR people in Colorado, who come up with a community earth system model, which is that picture. That's not typical. It's important, but it's not typical. I just want to step into the world of CH and just hot off the press talk about a couple of examples that I think are illustrative of the true state of the art, away from the well-funded climate change research. I met some statisticians just last week, and this is their current science. This is completely indicative of the kind of integrative big science that's demanded. What they have is a biogeochemistry model, which is developed in Bangor, in Wales, by a particular scientist. You don't need to know too much about this, but it understands soils effectively in their biogeochemistry, and it takes inputs which are impacts of climate change and nitrogen and sulfur deposition, and what it does is it produces an output which is the condition of the soils, its pH, nitrogen carbon composition, and so on. So that model runs, it works, it's been well studied, it's a good piece of science. It's a great example of the narrow specific science that environmental scientists have excelled at. I believe it's a good model, it's been well published and peer reviewed. What they wanted to do was to do a study of that, feed in the changes in soils, and look at change in ecology and plant ecology. What impact would the changes over time have on different species of plant ecology? We had another model developed in Lancaster by a statistician called Multimove, which looks at response of flora to changes in climate and changes in soil condition. And what you get are graphs like that for different flora. You see sensitivities to change. This is a particular species. I'm not going to pronounce the first part, so I can pronounce the second part, Alba, Gaelic for, where's the Gaelic speakers? Gaelic for Scotland. A particular species, no doubt, that's prominent in the north of the British Isles. And you can see that that's a rather steep change. It shows that this plant is very sensitive to climate change and is actually an indicator of climate change. So with very small changes, this plant would disappear, as many species are, plant and animal, in response to climate change. That all looks really good. So I spoke to them about what they have to do in this study, and what they want to do is run these models tens of thousands of times and really understand the sensitivities and the complexities and the interrelationships and understand the coupling here in a complex ecosystem. But what is the state of the art? I was shocked. The model at the top is a process model, as I talked about earlier, written in R. Sorry, not written in R, written in Fortran, as many of these models are. And we all know how sophisticated the middlewares are to couple Fortran with other worlds. You know, it's the first language we think about when we develop our model-driven engineering transformation tools, isn't it? How do we map to Fortran? So it's a Fortran model of some complexity. I think there's only one guy in the UK that understands how it works. The floristic response model is not a process model, it's a stochastic model, and it's written in R. They have no natural way of combining models executing in Fortran and R. Can they run on the cloud to exploit elasticity? No, they run on their own individual workstations and haven't yet developed any means of running them in the cloud and been able to, you know, fire up instances elastically. They haven't got that far yet. The models were developed in isolation. The outputs of the first model are things like nitrogen, carbon, phosphorus. The inputs to the other model are a domain-specific language. These guys have come up with a scoring system for soils that talk about soil enrichment on a scale 1 to 10. And nobody has defined how pH, nitrogen, carbon maps onto this scoring system. It's completely qualitative. So the outputs from one do not correspond to the inputs to another. What they do at the moment is they do one run of this model and then they mail the results across to the other side who look at this Excel spreadsheet, scratch their heads and think, what do these values mean? How do I transfer them into the inputs to the second model? And they've developed a transfer function, as they call it, which is a simpler linear regression, which they don't believe. But what can they do? And then they take the mail, they run it through this transfer function, they run their model once on their laptop, and they get outputs for one input with no ability to understand the uncertainties in the system. That really shocked me. They have to deliver this piece of research in a year's time. They have to get from where they are now, which is so primitive, to a sophisticated report at the end in a year's time. They need tools. I was shocked by the state of the art, not in the excellence of the science, not in the science that went into the individual models, but in the frameworks they have to integrate and reason about complex systems. Shocking. A second study, I'll go through this quickly. The interesting lesson here, this is a paper that was published in Nature. A gold star for their community. You know, that's what they strive for. And this was a similar study, but it was looking at changing temperatures in the UK. That picture of the UK is not typical, I have to say. All that red. All that heat coming up from the south, maybe 1 week a year. But anyway, they were looking at temperature changes and the impact on species and bird life on different indicators of biodiversity. This was work that was carried out about a year ago. What I found fascinating was their use of. Have anybody heard of a tool called BioVel Taverna? You know, if we were sitting here as computer scientists saying, what model do you need to run these complex models? What would it be? You know, how many of us would say, well, actually, of course, the eScience community produced workflow. You just have to use workflow. Your workflow is the model. Having studied your world in great depth over a cup of coffee, use workflow. It has to be right. Surely that's the response of us as modelers. What was fascinating was how workflow was completely the wrong tool. It did not work. A salutary lesson for the arrogance of computer scientists to understand the world of user domains. The reasons it didn't work I'm still unpicking and unfolding, but it was clear. Partly the tools were the engineering decisions and the tools were wrong and didn't work with the volume or range of data parameters that they use in the natural environment. So partly a reason of the tooling, but there's something way more subtle than that. that it was the wrong paradigm, and that in understanding uncertainty, scientists feel their way into data. They only understood the workflow at the end of the process. Imposing a workflow at the start was like putting a straitjacket on their science. It was the wrong tool. I would never have anticipated that. And that's why we have to work closely with domains to understand their world, to do true domain-specific languages. More of that later. So the implementation space, I'm going to go through this quicker. I'm going to just check my time as well. Time is running out. The implementation space, this is what we understand, so I don't have to dwell on this. What I'm looking at in particular in my fellowship is what I sometimes called an eternal braid of technology. 3 technologies that sit beautifully together. The technology of the Internet of Things. Can the Internet of Things help transform environmental science? Real-time streaming data. Surely that's going to be a really positive help in helping them understand what's happening in the natural environment now. Is the natural environment not the killer application for IoT technology? I remain to be convinced about smart cities. Perhaps some of you in the audience can convince me later of the killer application of smart cities. Perhaps it is ordering beer when your fridge runs out. Perhaps that is what we're all striving for in society. Or perhaps getting better insight into the natural environment is actually, maybe there's something in that as a real use of IoT technology. Cloud technology. Your cloud technology is all about pulling things together in one place. Having the ability to, once you've got them in one place, integrate them. Having what is effectively, to environmental scientists, not infinite resources, because no resource is infinite, it'd be a contradiction to this talk, but having elastic resources to fire off many models and to do the integration of data for these many models, feed the models in. Surely that elasticity is absolutely right. And also, through opening up, you're bringing in a community response. You've opened up the science, you have your models running in the cloud. Science becomes more reproducible. Other people can look at science and can run the same experiments. School kids can have a look at climate change models and learn about this science. Science can come alive for all of us. So Internet of Things is going to generate a lot of data. Cloud has the ability to manage and store and manage and reason about this data. And data science, as already said, has the ability to give us better tools to reason, which in turn might provide input to the other data values we may need. So a true triangle of technologies that work well together. I'm just going to quickly go through some experiences I've had in previous projects. The first was a UK collaboration to look at cloud computing, called the Environmental Virtual Observatories pilot project. The pilot, the small p meant they didn't have enough funding to do it properly, so they'll do a pilot. But it was a fascinating project and taught me so much. If you want to read anything in this world, in this area, read Science as an Open Enterprise with the Royal Society. It's not often I point to Royal Society reports for wonderful reading. They're not known for their wonderful tomes, but that is really a truly transformative piece of writing. I'm just going to jump to the analysis. One thing that we found from that is that cloud computing really can deliver. One of the positive things about cloud computing is it's a professional service that's ready for use by a community like this. There's plenty of choice out there, whether you go down a public or proprietary route. It's a mature technology that really has the potential to transform science. I think we demonstrated through that project that transformative potential is real. But there are huge problems as well that need to be overcome. The level of heterogeneity in cloud provision is a well-documented problem, but it's a huge concern to the environmental community. The environmental community cannot also afford, this is the environmental community perhaps in Europe, perhaps in the UK, they cannot make a decision that these guys in Google are the right providers and will lock in our data sets to Google or Amazon. They can't make that decision. They need to have flexibility and freedom to move and migrate. They can't afford that lock-in. They can't afford the time or distraction to learn multiple APIs. We need to move towards a world where this is more seamless. A more subtle but important problem is also cloud services have clearly been developed for e-commerce or to analyze the web. Tools like MapReduce are wonderful, and I'm sure many of you here have used MapReduce. What a powerful tool to do distributed computing in 5 minutes. Yeah, it's a great technology to understand vast data sources in a short time and write parallel programs to break it into chunks to do your map operation, to have your intermediary results, pull them all together. It's a great result for one particular model, one particular pattern of computation. That's not the model environmental scientists use. Complete misfit. Complete misfit. I set off some master's students to develop some typical environmental modelling scenarios in MapReduce. Wasn't that cruel? It just doesn't work. It's the wrong paradigm. We're better than that. We understand concurrency better. Pick up a textbook in concurrency. There's 101 patterns in there. Surely we should be able to provide the right concurrency patterns for environmental scientists. Surely we can provide software frameworks that are more flexible. So, too many assumptions, too many locked-in assumptions. You guys are something that will get something to say about that, surely. Second experience, IoT. I already motivated this. What we did was another pilot project. When funding councils run short of money, they love pilot projects, don't they? So this was an 18-month pilot. And what we did was we instrumented an area in North Wales. And what we wanted to do was to look at the complexity of ecosystems in North Wales. So we deployed in the wild some sensor technology and a beautiful catchment area around the Snowdon mountain, the highest point in Wales. Truly beautiful, stunning, and scientifically fascinating area with many different soil types and different aspects to look at, an area of great scientific interest. So we looked at the hydrology of the area, we looked at the soils in the area, we looked at animal movements. The animal movements, as a slight aside, became the bane of my life, because the press picked up on this and decided this was the internet of sheep. Google my name and internet of sheep. It went viral. It went viral on Boxing Day last Christmas. I had reporters phoning me up on Boxing Day saying, can we get a quote? Not good. Viral storms are really interesting until you're at the heart of one. It wasn't the internet of sheep. That was one aspect of it. It was an internet of the natural environment, including sheep movements. Did you know there's 3 million people in Wales and 9 million sheep? Fascinating fact. So we built an Internet of Things and we got the data back in the cloud and we analysed the data and all was well. It worked, just about. We deployed it last November. We deployed it in the middle of Storm Desmond, which you might think was fascinating scientifically because we recorded the heaviest rainfall ever in the north of Wales. But it was such a boring period to observe, because we were looking at things like soil saturation patterns and animal behaviour, animal movements, to look at risk to water quality. I can talk more about that later if anybody's interested. The graphs were so boring, it was just like this. Saturated, saturated. No variation in the data whatsoever. So although we recorded a very interesting period of time, scientifically there just wasn't enough variety. So we'd love to do this again and look at richer data sets over a more varied period of time, and that's an experiment I'd like to continue in my fellowship. We also used Arduino. There was an interesting talk yesterday which looked at tools which help the conversation with specific domains. You need to work with these people and not work with them, alongside them. It's all a big team to understand what technology could do. Arduino was great for that, not because it's the best IoT technology. It's very frustrating at times, but it was a technology they could use. They were in the conversation as equal partners. We evolved towards an understanding of what this technology could do together, which, linked with agile methods, was a very powerful way forward. So analysis. I think we're in danger of overselling the Internet of Things. When you actually have to deliver an IoT for real customers with real needs and a real need to understand the natural environment, it's very immature technology. And I think that became apparent. The cracks were all too visible to the scientific community. They got very excited about IoT and then realized what it could deliver. The lack of standards, the lack of off-the-shelf solutions that just work is a major problem. But when you combine it with cloud technology, you do have exactly the kind of platforms that have the ability to take what I talked about a step further. New data sources feeding into the cloud and then having the analysis tools already talked about. I do worry though, we're building complex distributed systems, going back to my own territory, that are way in advance of our ability to manage them. How do you reason about interoperability in a complex world of Arduino technology and different cloud providers? How do you program these things? How do scientists program these things? Which is a more pertinent thing, because the computer scientists work alongside them and then go away. How do scientists program these things in their world, in their language, in a domain-specific language? How do you manage these things so they're secure and reliable and robust? What level of abstraction are we offering from these systems? So, being a middleware researcher, I love this picture of Munch. If anybody wants, I'm not going to get sued for using this. I guarantee you, I'm not going to get sued for using this Munch. I'm not going to tell you why. Find me over a coffee and I'll tell you an interesting story about why I'm not going to get sued for using this image. If you guys use it, you'll get sued. I'm not. But, I just think, what is middleware in this complex world of distributed systems? Does it really have to just completely rethink what it is? I think middleware has lost its sense of purpose. What do we need in this world to respond to these highly complex distributed systems? So I'm going to move on now. I want to talk about you guys. I'm just going to conclude quickly. I had two parts to this, but I'm going to reduce it to one part. This is a very famous editorial by my good friend Doug Schmidt, my fellow middleware conspirator. And here he talks about the promises of model-driven engineering to alleviate the complexity of platforms and express domain concepts effectively. I could unpick these and I could say, what can you guys deliver for each of these? What I'm going to do is just focus on the first, expressing domain concepts effectively, and zoom in on domain-specific languages. I'm convinced that domain-specific languages have something really important to say here. We're talking about domains. We're talking about environmental scientists running experiments and wanting to have experimental executions. We're talking about them reasoning about ensembles, having frameworks that think about uncertainty, that drive the ensembles, that feed in a range of different data sources. Surely this is a domain-specific language. Can we capture that domain-specific language and provide a tool which is not about Linux scripts and heterogeneous cloud providers and Arduino that sometimes works and runs out of battery when you most need the data? Can we hide that level and raise the level of abstraction way up to what Robert was wanting? Way up to their domain. What does that look like? What does that domain-specific language look like? And of course, it won't be one domain-specific language, it will be multiple domain-specific languages. Because you also have to reason about the concurrency model and the distribution model in terms that are perhaps more pertinent to me. So you can generate software frameworks, for example, that manage elasticity like MapReduce, but with the proper concurrency models that fit ensemble execution. That is doable. It's a challenge. I wouldn't call that a grand challenge, but it's doable. Now, since we actually, myself and John Whittle, have a collaboration that's just starting on this, so we're going to do this. So I open out to you guys in this community for insight and help. That's why I'm really pleased to be here. If you feel you have tools and techniques that can help us, talk to myself and John. But I have looked around the community, and this is where I want to, so I'm going to jump forward a little bit. I have looked around the community at your response and where you are as a community. Let me say, as a friendly outsider, I think it'd be good for you guys to have the jolt that environmental scientists have had. I've seen how healthy it's been for that community to be forced to work together, to raise their game, to tackle the bigger problems. I think some of the work in this community is terrific. I look at some of the work in model transformation and fundamental principles. What great work. That has to be coupled, though, with applying that work in a way that's ready for the grand challenges of our time. And I think the problem implementation gap has simply not been closed to a level that does that. I do not see the techniques for domain-specific languages that are ready for what we want to do. I may be wrong, I'm not immersed in your community. I think you're missing a trick. I think you're sitting in a gold seam and you don't realise it. That jolt for the environmental science community, wouldn't it be really good if you guys had a similar jolt and upped your game and did science that's ready for the grand challenges of our time? Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Gordon, for this very inspiring talk. So we have few time for different questions. Yep. There is a mic.
Thank you. Thank you for, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for a very inspiring talk. You finished about the jolt, and there's a question I was waiting with. You said that the movie was a life changer for you.
Yep.
And here we see more the computer being used on part of like getting more data, understanding better what to do, or having more data to prove to people. Can you see ways that the computer can be used in making this jolt more broad? You spoke about high school students maybe doing experiments, I don't know, but totally different ways, advertising, getting this movie to everybody, or totally different dimensions of making the jolt.
Yeah, I don't think the computer has the role to make the jolt. I think you guys have it within you to respond to the jolt. Yeah. I think communicating with school kids is great, but let's not deflect it. You know, we have 300 people here. This is a good cross-section of the model-driven engineering community. You're sitting in a gold mine. What's your response? I think that's the most interesting question I would pose.
Okay. Thank you.
I hope that answers your question.
Not really, but we can continue that offline.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Was a question? Yep.
Yeah, hi, thanks again. You've talked about the scientists and the computer scientists that use models, but one of the challenges we have thought with some of the people that try to think of using models for sustainability is how we could make the average people use models, or access to models, or play with models, you know, for example, to take decisions on their own way they might influence these problems. So do you have any complementary, because you didn't talk too much about individuals here.
Yeah, that's a good question. How do we make I think what we have to do, as with any community, let me not oversell the grand challenge of climate change. That's my jolt, that's my response. There's many grand challenges out there around aging population, for example, and health informatics. So my talk could generalize to many different communities. I think if we're going to respond as scientists to some of the grand challenges of our time, we have to invest effort to get alongside these communities and work with them in an equal partnership. I keep using this phrase, equal partnership. We must not approach these communities saying we have the models, you know, you should be using them. I think we've got to go with a certain element of modesty that our models may be wrong, and to work alongside them, and from that to be prepared to shift and move together, scientists, computer scientists, towards the right models. And I think if we have these conversations and we invest time in these relationships, I think it will be good for both sides. I think there'll be more profound breakthroughs in the modelling community because you're providing the models that are right. You're providing domain-specific languages that are domain-ready, and they will use them because they've been party to developing them. They have ownership, they understand, there's a mutual understanding and meeting in the middle. And that's a time-consuming process, but I don't think you can shortcut that.
Thanks. Do you think that the challenges that you talk about are fundamentally engineering and usability kind of challenges? In other words, making these technologies, which we feel fairly comfortable with, available to scientists and so forth, or are there more fundamental, foundational questions that still need to be answered?
Both. Absolutely both. Absolutely. What I'm talking about is my personal response as well. What do I bring? I happen to be a professor of distributed systems. My response is, what can I do for a grand challenge of today? So mine is a very personal response, looking at a particular cut through this problem. I think my work is increasingly applied, so I've perhaps left some of the foundational work behind. But we all need to be in this together in a kind of rich plethora of responses, which involves foundational work, applied work, in the wild work, communication work. There's political dimensions to this. It's a big space. we're all individuals, but together we can all find a response, and if we all move together, amazing things can happen.
Okay, so we do have some time for our last question, if there is. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. Don't you think that the reward systems in our institutions hinder this sort of attack on the grand challenges? For example, in our models community, we are rewarded if we are first authors, if we bring in grants. But once we start to collaborate, how do we reward our collaborations?
Terrific, terrific question. I mean, I guess what's happening in the UK is typically of what's happening in the rest of the world. As computer scientists, we're being measured. And we're being measured in our outputs, and we're being measured by papers and top journals and citations. We're increasingly being measured, and that forces us into safe territory. I mean, my head of department sitting here, thankfully he's also a collaborator, so he's involved as a partner in crime. But I guess heads of department will say, publish your papers in the same places, do foundational research, do theoretical models, churn out the papers, get them cited, it will look good as a computer science department, will shoot up the ratings. That's terribly damaging. I'm increasingly getting to the perspective that is terribly damaging, and where we have to be, particularly as computer science, going back to the comments I made earlier about how ubiquitous computer science has become. We're not there to support health informatics or environmental informatics, but we're there, and that is the nature of the beast. And I'm going to finish up publishing in journals in environmental science, which are of no use to my department whatsoever, because they don't fit the mold, and that's, the reward system's wrong for the challenges of our time. Am I going to change? No, because I'm committed to the path I'm on, and wouldn't it be great if the reward system's actually changed? I need to be a great optimist to think that that's the sense of direction, but that's a really good question, and it's a really big problem for communities going forward and doing this more applied work, really important work. So thank you for that question.
Okay, and thank you to you for your great talk. I think we can thank again Gordon for this keynote. And I'm really pleased to offer you a book that has been written by a French chef, and which is signed personally for you.
Oh, thank you very much.